Inflation is always and everywhere a monetary phenomenon. Okay, let's dive right into this explainer with that absolute bombshell of a quote. That single sentence, uttered by the Nobel Prize-winning economist Milton Friedman, basically set the stage for an intellectual detective story that still sharply divides economists today. I mean, think about it. Is the price of your groceries rising because of corporate greed, broken supply chains, or simply because the government printed way too much money?
Well, welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're unpacking the mechanics of monetarism. That's the school of thought pioneered by Friedman, and we're going to figure out exactly how the money supply interacts with the prices we pay every single day. We'll explore why this idea totally revolutionized economics, look at the surprisingly elegant math behind it, and then test it against the wild economic roller coasters we've seen in the 21st century.
So, here's our roadmap for today. First, a monetary phenomenon. Second, the equation of exchange. Third, rethinking the Phillips curve. And finally, the modern money debate.
Let's jump right into Section 1, a monetary phenomenon, and how Friedman challenged the status quo. To really grasp why Friedman's theory was such a game-changer, we have to understand what he was rebelling against in the 1960s. Following the Great Depression and World War II, Keynesian economics was the undisputed heavyweight champion. Keynesians believed that aggregate demand was the master switch of the economy, and the best way to flip that switch was through fiscal policy, government spending and taxation. They honestly believed that monetary policy, just changing interest rates or the money supply, was kind of useless for controlling inflation. Well, Friedman and the monetarists flipped this entirely on its head. They argued that fiscal policy was largely ineffective and that monetary policy, specifically how fast the money supply grows or shrinks, was the real potent driver of the economy.
That brings us to Section 2, the equation of exchange, or the math behind the theory. Now, Friedman didn't just rely on abstract philosophy. He actually revived an older theory from the economist Irving Fisher to prove his point mathematically. He turned this beautifully simple equation to ground monetarist thinking. MV equals PQ. It's essentially just an accounting identity. Let's break it down. M is the nominal quantity of money in the system. V is the velocity of money, basically how fast a single dollar bill changes hands out in the economy. P is the general price level of goods, and Q is the real value of final expenditures, or the actual stuff being produced. So money multiplied by its speed equals prices multiplied by output.
So, here's the absolute crucial point, the big assumption monetarists made about this equation. They assumed that the velocity of money, V, and the real output of the economy, Q, are completely fixed in the long run by outside forces. Think consumer habits and factory capacity, not how much money the central bank prints. If V and Q are stable, the math leaves us with a pretty stark reality. Any change in M, the amount of money, literally has to result in a change in P, the general price level. Print more money, get higher prices. Boom. It was an incredibly powerful, mathematically grounded argument.
Moving on to Section 3, rethinking the Phillips curve and the ripple effects on labor.
Because inflation doesn't happen in a vacuum, right? We have to look at the labor market. For a long time, the answer to whether higher inflation can lower unemployment was an enthusiastic yes. The traditional Keynesian view relied on the Phillips curve, which offered politicians a highly tempting trade-off. It told them, hey, if you're willing to tolerate slightly higher inflation, you can buy yourself a lower rate of unemployment. But Friedman, looking strictly at the mechanics of money, argued this trade-off was a total illusion. He, along with economist Edmund Phelps, introduced the concept of potential output, and NIRU. That stands for the non-accelerating inflation rate of unemployment. Essentially, they argued there's a natural structural baseline of unemployment in the economy. Any trade-off between inflation and unemployment is strictly temporary. You just can't permanently buy more jobs by printing more money.
The mechanics behind this illusion actually play out in a pretty vicious cycle. If politicians try to force unemployment below its natural rate by juicing the economy, it triggers a step-by-step chain reaction. First, the economy overheats. Second, inflation accelerates as suppliers cut into their excess capacity and jack up prices. But step 3 is the real kicker. That higher inflation becomes permanently baked into the expectations of households and businesses. Workers demand higher wages to match rising prices, companies raise prices to pay those wages, and suddenly, you're stuck in a nasty wage-price spiral.
And you know what? The world didn't have to wait long to see this play out in real time. The devastating stagflation of the 1970s, sparked by oil crises and supply shocks, resulted in a literal nightmare scenario for traditional economists. Double-digit inflation paired with high unemployment at the exact same time. This totally broke the traditional Phillips curve and forced a new consensus among economists that Friedman hit the nail on the head. The relationship between inflation and unemployment absolutely breaks down in the long term once our expectations shift.
Which brings us to Section 4, the modern money debate, where we test this theory against today's economy.
Since economics is constantly evolving, we have to ask, how does this 20th century framework hold up today? Mapping out recent history, we see a really fascinating contradiction. From 2010 through 2015, the broadest measure of the money supply, M2, increased by about 45%. That's way faster than GDP growth. According to strict monetarism, inflation should have absolutely skyrocketed, yet the inflation rate actually went down. But then, fast forward to 2020, the COVID-19 pandemic triggers the fastest M2 money supply growth in decades, and, right on cue, from 2021 to 2023, the world experienced a massive inflation surge. So what gives? Does the theory work or doesn't it?
Well, critics of monetarism are quick to point out that the modern economy has added a ton of messy variables that complicate that neat mathematical equation of exchange we looked at earlier. We've seen massive financial innovations and deregulation. On top of that, the velocity of money has been historically much lower. Basically, people and institutions were hoarding cash rather than spending it, which really mutes the inflationary effect. Add in severe global supply chain lockdowns and energy shocks from the war in Ukraine, and the picture gets incredibly murky.
In fact, things became so divorced from traditional monetarism that Federal Reserve Chairman Jerome Powell explicitly stated in late 2021 that the direct link between the money supply and inflation is basically a relic of the past. And he certainly wasn't alone in thinking that. Previous Fed chairs like Ben Bernanke and Alan Greenspan had reached the exact same conclusion, largely abandoning money supply targets altogether in favor of adjusting interest rates.
Yet, despite Powell's stance, the ghost of Milton Friedman hasn't entirely left the building. Look at surveys of top economists conducted by the University of Chicago Booth School during the recent inflation surge. While they absolutely acknowledged that the global supply chain crisis caused short-term pain, there was a deep consensus that the combined effect of highly stimulative fiscal and monetary policies posed a severe risk of prolonged higher inflation. So the money, it seems, still matters deeply.
Which leaves us with this final, provocative thought to take away from our explainer today. Did the massive global inflation shock of 2021 to 2023 serve as the ultimate vindication for Milton Friedman's core warning about printing money? Or is our modern, highly deregulated, interconnected global economy simply too complex to be captured by a single, elegant equation? Definitely something to think about the next time you see the prices shift at your local grocery store.